Good morning once again. In case you are just joining us, and we are happy that you made that decision. Of course, we are just about to start our conversations that we had lined up for you this particular morning. Since the COP28 started in Dubai, we have witnessed a growing prominence and global discussion on climate mitigation, climate financing, building resilience. And it's actually a global conversation, but we have a role to play as Africa and also as Kenya. We want to understand some of the big issues that are coming from this high-level meeting, and of course, what is it that we can be able to take home with regards to our action points right here at home. And I have experts cutting across different sectors who will be helping me shape this particular conversation. Allow me just to run you through who I'm having this morning. Sitting on my far right, we are having Engineer Victor Okuna. He's a renewable energy engineer. Thank you, Victor, for creating time for us this morning.
Thank you.
And we have Margaret Kamau with us also this morning. She's the Principal Climate Change and Green Officer Growth at the African Development Bank. Asante for creating time.
Morning.
All right, and we have this morning also with us Dr. Jose Rono, Managing Partner, E&K Consulting Firm. Thank you for creating time. All right, at this very crucial time when COP28 is happening, and there's been a lot of questions with regards to whether this is giving us some sort of progress. Are we finding solutions? Are we understanding the depth of the problem and the crisis that we are facing as a globe? And that is why we are here to see whatever is coming from COP28 and see what is it that actually meets our needs as Africa and as Kenya. And I'd just like to begin with a round of your remarks on the feelings so far since these discussions began. It's not the very first time we are having this. Actually, it's coming just a few, should I say, weeks from the Nairobi summit, where we made a lot of, also there was momentum that was building with this particular conversation. But let's talk about COP28. I'll begin with you, Engineer. Since these discussions began in Dubai, do you get that sense that we are beginning to understand the depth of the crisis and actually how to fix it?
Oh, thanks. When you go back to the theme of the COP28, that is where you should actually begin. The theme of this year is we need to cut the temperature rise by 1.5 degrees by 2025. 2025 is just 1 year away. Definitely we've had 27 COPs, and the last one was in Egypt, where a delegation of Kenyan guys went there for the same. This year's theme is very crucial in a way that the temperature has been rising gradually across the globe, but no one has been there to really say, oh, we are having a problem with managing the temperature of our Earth or the globe. So they have seen that, no, let us work on the modalities that will see that by 2025, we cut the temperature rise by 1.5 degrees. I've really followed up since the African Climate Summit, and I think we are starting now to develop interest. Before, there was no interest. People used to go to COPs, you sit there and you wait for the days to go by, then you come back. Sort
of like a formality.
But, yeah, like a formality. But for the last few years, I think people have really now seen the effect of climate change. When we have floods, like what is going on today, when we have the wildfires going on across the globe, also we have the droughts. So people have started now to come and realize that indeed the climate change is hitting us, and it is hitting us so bad that if we don't take actions today, then we may not have this universe we call Earth in the near future. And the good thing is that they are not taking this issue of cutting the the temperature rise up to 2030, but they have brought it very close to us in just a year, so that if you are a head of government, if you are heading a department, you should be given 1 year to really look at the ways in which we are going to ensure that the carbon emissions that is actually leading to the rise of temperature is cut by at least 30%, so that we maintain our temperature in the globe.
All right. I'd like also to hear from you, Margaret, what has stood out for you, from the discussions happening in Dubai right now?
Thank you very much, Safin. Maybe for the benefit of explaining a bit of the background as to the COP. So the Conference of Parties is a meeting that is held, organized by the United Nations, and it is all the parties that are signature to the United Nations Convention that then come together on an annual basis to discuss and negotiate on matters related to climate change. And as Engineer just rightly mentioned, this is the 28th meeting that we're having. But the annual meeting is also complemented by mid-year meetings where the delegates meet to discuss the issues ahead of the main COP. The main idea is that because the negotiations that happen at the background are actually quite important towards setting the agenda for climate change, and it requires parties to sit together, to have some trade-offs, to have discussions on what they can agree on and what they can't agree on, and then they come together at the end of the year to now have a unified position that is now negotiated and signed off on. Now, this COP is quite key for us as Africa. In fact, we should really be shouting from the rooftops about it, because it is at this COP where, as a first start, we've had the operationalization of what we call the Loss and Damage Fund that African countries have and other countries in the world have been fighting for a number of years. And this Loss and Damage Fund goes towards financing the effects of climate change that are felt on a daily basis. So it helps countries transition away from emergency humanitarian aid requests towards a more structured format of how to access financing for impacts faced from climate change. So for me, that is the first, I'd say, is the first achievement for African countries that we should be quite key on. The second one I'd say is that this COP28 was also the point at which we were having the first global stocktake of the world. So to take us back to 2015, the countries came together again to sign what is known as the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement was the landmark agreement at the time on how countries would progress in terms of setting clear climate action. So before that, yes, there was a general direction, but from the Paris Agreement, countries were now required to come up with nationally determined contributions. And these were specific tasks that the country said, these are our priorities, and this is how we're going to achieve it. This is the finance required for it. So this year, in 2023, is the first global stocktake process where countries are now coming together and saying, okay, we set our nationally determined contribution as X, and by 2023, this is what we have achieved, and what do we need to do for the next 5-year cycle. Right. So in a 5-year cycle, there will be this updating of and enhancing of ambition and updating of NDCs.
All right. And this is happening this specific COP.
Yes, this specific COP.
All right. That's good to hear. And also, Dr. Rono, in your comprehensive assessment of what has been discussed so far, what are you reading? What are you getting from where you sit in terms of what we should expect as the end game of this COP28?
So thanks for having me, and I think let me step back and give some context.
All right, and I like how all of you are kind of like, let's go back to the basics.
Yes, so I think the issue about climate change is not necessarily a new thing. It's just is a gradual change in the climate architecture that takes millions of years. I think we're just in a situation where it is happening much faster, and we're in a situation that has been called the Anthropocene, which is almost attributable almost entirely to human activity. Like we as humans are causing a much faster change in the climate than would otherwise have been. So I think it's something that's been there for a long time. And so I feel like we are, with the COP meetings, we are trying to catch up, and a little bit too late to catch up with the climate change. And so for me, I'll give pros and cons. I think on the bright side, I think we're getting momentum and interest and focus from different players on this topic. We are getting a discussion that is beyond people who would consider themselves just climate experts. We're getting people from other sectors, whether it's in health, in agri, in finance, coming into this conversation. You'll notice now that even the WHO has listed climate as the top health concern globally, which signifies that there's a growing convergence of thought and concern around this topic, which is great, and I think the COP meetings are sustaining that momentum. And I think it is important to do that because systemic change will not happen by individual countries or individual engagements. At some point, we need to get a collective effort around the continent. The downside for me is that I think there's maybe too much optimism on the COP process, in the sense that there's a lot more expectation, even from African countries, that this will shift the needle. But if you look at other processes previously, this is not the first process we're doing. Mm-hmm. If you look at the process that have been done on the health side, which started much earlier, and even if you look at the SDGs, where I think only about 12% of the SDGs are on track, the bulk of them are either far behind or regressing. And if you look at the health process that African countries have engaged in, we've engaged with it in many years, but we are still far off from the target. So I think there isn't anything in history that suggests that just the excitement around an event will result in change. We've had a lot of excitement in Africa.
But ideally it should, right?
It should, but it hasn't. So if you look at the excitement around the World Health Organization meetings around raising investments for health, mm-hmm. we're still far below those targets. So I think I'm not saying we shouldn't have the COP meeting, but I think we need to move further than that and say, how do we hold governments accountable to put investments where they should be? And I think the process of embedding a tracking mechanism on the COP meetings is important, so that we don't just make declarations and then there's no follow-through. And I think that has been the pattern in the African continent for a long time, where we make a huge declaration and say we'll put 15% of our GDP on health, and no one does it. No country in Africa has done that consistently. So there's really very little to show that we'll actually do it for climate. We haven't done it in the past unless we do things differently.
All right.
And so for me, there's a lot of excitement around COP, but there's also, I think we need to approach it with a little bit of cautious optimism around what really we can get out of it.
Engineer Okuna, what do you think about what Dr. Rono has just raised? When we began this conversation, you actually, you were very categorical about the journey that the COP journey, let me call it that. This is actually the 28th. Yeah. He's saying that we are very excited about this and we are optimistic. And I'm telling him, ideally, this global sit-down should actually offer solutions to what is ailing us as an entire globe. Why is it not doing that? Why don't we seem like we are moving?
Actually, the excitation part to most of people actually attending COP is not the theme of the COP itself. Mm-hmm. If you look at today's newspaper, there's anger in Namibia over Dubai COP28 trip by president's children. Mm-hmm. That one tells you that the excitation part, those who are going to COP27, COP28, they are not going there for any other business, but they are going there maybe for per diem, allowance and trips.
So we are missing the point.
We are really, and that is where,
the smile on Margaret's face.
And
no, we go there, we miss the point.
If you look at the Kenyan delegations to Egypt last year, it was around 300 people who went for the COP27. Then we were back to the country for the African Climate Summit. It was a span of around 10 months. We asked, I was in the African Climate Summit, that those guys who attended the COP27, is there any single thing that you came up with from COP27 that you've done at home, not even here in Nairobi, but starting from home? I've attended the COP27, then you've had 2 weeks of debates, discussions, conferences, and anything else. So the question that should linger in our mind is, once I attend a COP27 or COP28 and I'm back in the country, is there any solution that I can give to our people back at home, in our villages, where people are living, so that they can see, or something can be done to show that indeed I went to COP28 and this is what I came up with? That is what is missing in the African culture. Africans, we are going to COP27 or COP28 today for us to get allowances because they are being paid for. If we can get our mind from
Is
such
that all
kind,
Africans? I just want you to be clear.
I don't know, because I don't come
Is that
from
everyone who goes to COP, or
that is, if you look a country angered because of president's children visit in Africa, then it tells you that even if our president's family did not go there, but you find that the delegations of Kenyans to that event were overestimated. So we just need to have specific people. For the president to get a 600 billion, that is very good. But you don't need a 300 people delegation to go to Egypt or to go to Emirates for us to get money. Let us have a streamlined people so that we know that this person is going for COP to do specific duties. This person is going to COP to have specific functions in that in that conference.
All right.
Yeah.
But then, you know, there was that clarification that the head of state went with only 51 in his delegation. The others, I don't know, they are not from, like, necessarily government. They could be from elsewhere.
Yeah. They're from, most of them are from the government institutions. I can assure you, the county governments. And we had a conference yesterday in COP28. We even have the ministry, the Interior Ministry. Actually, the speaker there is the Interior Ministry, speaking on behalf of gender. It was gender-based mitigations. So if we have a gender-based mitigation where a ministry, somebody from the Ministry of Interior is a moderator or a speaker, then it tells you that we are mixing things up. I expect maybe someone to speak about gender and climate change mitigation should come from maybe the Ministry of Gender, because we really have Ministry of Gender. But we are really mixing up. The president has his 51 people. The ministry has their own people. The county council of governors, if you are here, you can get the figures. I don't have the figures, I can't speak. You need to also do analysis. How many people went to COP27? How many people went to COP28 by the department? So that we also have the Council of Governors. How many people from the COG went to the COP? How many people from the departments went to the COP? So that we, at the end of the day, we are responsible for the Kenyans who elected us to the office. The president cannot say that we have 51 people who are going to bargain for development money. Him as the president, the state, then we have the minister, then we have the ambassador. Those are the three key people who should act on the behalf of the Republic.
All right, well said. Margaret, before I close this up, for us to go back to now what is on the agenda list, I want to get your feeling. He's talking about, you know, we've had meetings, but we don't seem to be meeting the objective of this meeting. He's talking about missed priorities, and the intention of some of these people going to COP could actually be one of our biggest challenge right now. What's your feeling, Margaret?
So let me explain a bit about the COP meeting. So you tend to have the party delegates, who are then the country representatives. They've been nominated by the countries to go to attend this meeting. And then you also have observers who are agencies or organizations, for example, the African Development Bank. We attend as an observer. But even within the party delegates, I think Dr. Rono just said it quite clearly about the cross-sectoral nature of climate change. The Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Climate Change will lead the delegation, which is led by the Minister for Environment. But you will need to have delegates on your team from other sectors. You'll have to have representation from National Treasury, from agriculture, from water, because that is the nature by which climate change negotiations are held. Now, what we do see the front facing, where we have the side events. You would have the presidents attending a high-level dialogue, or you'd have ministers attending a meeting. But at the background, it's actually negotiators. Africa does have trained negotiators, through which actually the African Development Bank does fund the Africa group of negotiators to attend these meetings. And the whole idea is, at these negotiations that are happening in the background, it's actually the text of the agreement that is being discussed. So at the end of COP28, in the last day, the party delegates will come together and discuss this negotiated text and then agree on whether to adopt it or not. So when we're talking about this issue of who attended, I think it's safer to look at what was actually discussed, what was the outcome at the end of
that was happening.
Yes, what was the outcome at the end of the COP, and what then does it mean for Africa? And you then tend to see that after the delegates come back to the country, so for example in Kenya, they will have a session to feed back to broader stakeholders about this is what Kenya achieved at COP28 and this is what it means going forward. Because as you know, as part of our constitution, public participation is quite key. So the ministry tends to have a meeting ahead of COP and after COP to feed back. So I'd say that the people who are present are definitely there for a good reason. They're there to discuss. But also the side events are quite crucial in terms of driving the climate agenda. So there are some agreements that are struck or some partnerships that are formed at the sidelines of these meetings, because this is perhaps the only meeting where you'll get the Minister of Finance meeting with, for example, the African Development Bank president. You know, then at that meeting you then discuss, oh, these are the priorities that we have and this is how you can help us achieve it. And then you end up with an agreement coming out of that. Right. Let me give an example, just to give it a bit more meat. So from the African Development Bank side, we've been very clear about the role that we're going to play in driving climate change action on the continent, because we realize that as a premier financial institution on the continent, we have a role to play in terms of supporting member countries to access this climate finance. But Africa's challenge has always been about accessing adaptation finance. You know, mitigation finance has not been a problem. We have a number of renewable energy plants. We have a number of initiatives that are towards mitigation action. But adaptation has always been a key sticking point for African countries. Now, in addition to at the COP, there's always been a standing request from developing countries towards developed countries, pay us money for the adaptation costs that we require. There's been a 100 billion target that was set way back, I think, in 2009, that still hasn't been set, that hasn't been achieved. Countries haven't received this finance. But as the Africa Development Bank, we decided, you know, we're not going to wait to see if this 100 billion will come through. We have established our own climate action window, which was actually launched at this COP on Monday. We had the National Treasury there represented at the launch. And the climate action window is quite key because it says these least developed countries in Africa, and in our terms we have 37 countries that we term as least developed countries. They are unable to access climate finance from the normal climate funds that we know about, for example, the Green Climate Fund, because the process towards accessing that financing is usually quite stringent and quite long, so it takes quite a long time for them to get that money. On the other hand, they're not in a position to access concessional finance. The only finance that would work for them in terms of climate action is concessional, is grants. Grants-based or highly concessional loans. So through the climate action window, we're looking to channel about 429 million to all these countries, the 37 African countries that we term as least developed countries, and to help them to achieve those priorities that they set out in their nationally determined contributions and their national adaptation plans.
All right. Yeah. I'll come back to you so that we can break that down further. But now that you've taken us to the issue of climate financing, I know you have something to add. Just pick it from where she has ended. You know, what should be our priority areas? Because having the funds is one thing, but then do we even understand what the priorities are for Africa? Let me begin with you, Dr. Rono.
So just to close on this conversation, I think the multi-sectoral engagement at COP is useful. And I think the idea of connecting dots beyond what is traditionally considered climate to other sectors, whether it's food or agri or finance or health, is critical. And I think that representation at COP is useful. And I think for us at E&K Consulting Firm, we do work across sectors, and we think our job is really to connect the dots, because the impact, the health impact on climate is significant. I think about 5% of climate change is driven by health systems. So just by running your health system, you're contributing negatively to climate. So it's very difficult to say we are doing mitigation without having everyone around the table. But having said that, I think the bit about financing is an interesting one, because I think there were many declarations at COP. I think the UAE announced about $272 billion for climate finance. There was a lot of amounts of funding that was declared by different parties. which is useful. And I think the idea that we should have dedicated or better tailored financing mechanisms for low-income countries or countries in conflict is useful. However, I think, again, if we learn from the past, I think there's a bit of double counting that we need to avoid. If you remember the TCAD conference, there were announcements around, the TCAD conference happened here in Nairobi. There was an announcement of financing mechanisms by different agencies, but they're referring to the same amount of money. So someone announces a significant amount of money at TCAD, but it's actually domiciled at the World Bank, and that is counted as a grant still to Kenya. And I think what then that places the colleagues in Treasury in a difficult position is that you are now forced to borrow from Peter to pay Paul, where you're Minister of Finance, you've got to pay, you have a commitment to the Global Fund, you have a commitment for vaccines at Gavi, you have a commitment to a climate financing that you received. So ultimately, the pot of funds that the country has is finite, and you're more or less pulling the Treasury in different directions. So we would go at COP and you get, a concessional loan that you need to pay back. A few months later, you go for the World Health Assembly and you commit to a different pot of funding, and you've got to pay that back. So I think the idea that we can convert these conversations is useful. Otherwise, we end up pulling our little resources in very different directions, and we've seen that a lot in health, where you have a commitment to the Global Fund, you pay that, but by paying that, it means you're taking money outside of something else. So I think ultimately that convergence of conversation is useful. And the last point I would mention here is that I think for Africa to really benefit, I think we need to invest on some systemic improvements, including metrics for measuring our carbon absorption, etc. Because the agreements are based on metrics, and if we're not able to measure what our contribution is to the global climate mitigation, then we really are negotiating from a very weak position. So I think we more or less need to invest in that baseline infrastructural or systemic investments that we need to enable us go into these meetings and negotiate from a point of having data and being able to speak from a point of data. Because I think my sense is, without that, then we go into the negotiating table with the argument that other countries are contributing more than us, but without any specific metric to say that, okay, Kenya is absorbing this much carbon, how much can we be compensated compared to Burundi or Rwanda?
All right. Yeah. So you're going to the negotiating table without, you don't have like the tools, and you're not armed to really negotiate for what
so it's a quality of the negotiation in my view. That matters. I think we have a lot of representation. I think, not to discredit any work that's been done at COP, but I think is that ultimately the quality of the cases you can make? What's the case you're making on the table?
I know it's really burning.
Safin, let me just maybe say something regarding what he said.
Great.
About the data. It is one of the issues that we are going to use for bargaining. But we have a very big issue when it comes to data analysis and monitoring. What happens is that there's something called the carbon credits. It will go to someone who can tell you that this is the amount of energy I have produced using the renewable energy. But take, for example, a farmer, a mama mboga or a boda boda, having a small thermal water pump somewhere in River Athi, doing irrigation for the tomatoes you use in Nairobi. And actually, I can tell you today that 90% of the tomatoes, vegetables, and so forth, and food we get here in Mudhurwa or Nairobi in general, comes from these small-scale traders doing irrigation along the rivers. We have a number of rivers around. How are these people going to measure that in a year I was using diesel generators? Actually, most of them are using diesel generators. Assume that they convert to solar, wind, or anything else.
Green energy.
How are they going to monitor their systems so that in every year they are able to quantify that I have generated this number of kilowatt hours so that I can now be given such amount of shillings. And when it comes to KenGen, actually KenGen is the biggest generator using renewable energies. And definitely, if we are going to finance people based on this, then KenGen is going to get the highest pay when it comes to carbon credits. But my question is, the work of KenGen is actually to generate power to you and me for my business back at home. So why should they be paid for the work they're supposed to do? They are supposed to ensure that the energy we receive today in my home, the energy that we are supposed to receive at our farms for irrigation, actually comes from the renewable energy. But because they have that capacity to measure, they have the capacity to analyze the energy production every day, every second, then the whole of carbon credits will go to them. My advice is we should look at mechanism. Instead of taking billions of money and paying KenGen for generating energy, which should be their work. Actually, if I lack power in my home, it is because KenGen, Kenya Power, and the ministry has not done what it's supposed to do to ensure that I am powered. So what these carbon credits and climate financing, even though we are going to finance big companies that have modalities to analyze data, to me, I think the heads of states and the heads of government should come and re-strategize and rethink that this money should actually go to Mama Mboga down there, because when you sum up the energy generation by those thermal plants, those smaller ones, they can actually go past the grid power we have.
All right, hold that thought for me. I want us to take a very short break. We have a lot to take in already, and the conversation continues after this particular break. We're just taking a very short break. We will be right back with this very important conversation, and continue sharing with us your thoughts, your questions. We want to know what you want to understand with the conversations happening at COP28. Any thoughts, any proposals on solutions that we need as Africa, we welcome all that at Citizen TV Kenya, at Safin_Ching. The hashtag is Daybreak.